So if you're a Dragon Ball Z fan or have watched some of the shows, you've probably seen fusion before. You take two powerful characters and combine them into something entirely different, something stronger, something that reaches another level. And that got me thinking about Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett. These are already two legends on their own. But what happens if they fuse and put them together? As an offensive coordinator, what do you even do? Do you double team Donald? Do you double team Garrett? What are your options? Do you try to block both? What plays can you even run, right? So then I started wondering, what if we combine everything they've accomplished individually and treated them like a single defensive force? What would that actually look like? Would the data show two great players standing next to each other? Or would it show something entirely different? Something closer to a Super Saiyan? And that's what I wanted to find out. And with that, welcome everyone. This is Data Divided, where I break data into what matters. I quickly want to touch on my background so you understand the lens that I'm bringing to this. I have 13 plus years working as an analyst, most of that in the wealth management space, education, most aligned to what this project is going to be. I have a master's in data science. I also am a huge sports fan. I've done other videos on this channel for the NFL, basketball, but I watch football, baseball, basketball, hockey, big sports fan. I have another YouTube channel where I open sports cards. So, little crossing both genres here. All right. And if you'd like to support the channel, there's a couple ways to do that. Do the like, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. I do have an eBay store where I sell all my sports cards. Go check out my other YouTube channel at Card Analyst on YouTube. And I also have a link to Buy Me Coffee. It's a place where you can support content creators. It's not like Patreon where you have to do a subscription or anything like that. But if you'd like to leave a tip and a nice comment, I'd greatly appreciate it. All right. So what is data science? I mentioned that I have a master's in this, but what exactly is it? I think if you were to ask multiple people who have studied data science, and please note that you don't need to have a college degree in it to be a data scientist, but if you were to ask multiple people in that profession or field, it can mean a lot of different things, whether machine learning, AI, how I have used it in sort of a professional setting. I like to think of it in this 6-step process. First, you identify the problem or what you're trying to solve for. It's not really a problem in this case, but it's what would it look like if Myles Garrett and Aaron Donald combined, if they were on the field? Is it hype or historic, right? What does the data show? Second step is you gather all the data. Third is you have to cleanse the data. What is meant by cleanse the data is you have to do feature engineering to it. Maybe you have to identify missing data values. How do you handle that? You want to cleanse it so you only have the certain columns or data that you need for your specific model. There's a whole thing on that. I won't go too much into that, but that's what it means. Fourth is your model selection. I have 4 different analyses that I'll run, which I'll talk about here in a bit. Evaluate the results. You want to look through your models, make sure you didn't have an error, everything looks good. And then 6, present the results. What you're going to see through this is you're not going to watch me gathering data and cleansing it and doing all that other junk. I'm just going to be presenting results today. All right, before we jump into the results, we need to establish the rules. Because if I ask 10 football fans whether this could be the greatest defensive duo ever, I'd probably get 10 different answers, right? Just like if you asked who's better, LeBron or Jordan, okay? You know, some people would focus on sacks, others would focus on championships, some would care about longevity, others would only care about peak performance. And that's exactly why I built an analysis framework. Think of it as a blueprint for how we're going to answer the question. Instead of relying on a single statistic or a single opinion, we're going to look at this from 4 different angles. Because a question this big can't be answered by one number. First, we'll look at individual greatness. How rare are Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett as players before we even put them together? Next, we'll look at positional impact because these two attack offenses from completely different areas of the field. Then we'll compare them against some of the greatest defensive pairings in NFL history. All right. Because if we're going to call something historic, we need to know what historic actually looks like. And finally, we'll look for something even rare. Not just greatness, not just elite production, but whether this combination qualifies as a true historical outlier. Now, here's the important part. Any one of these analyses could be misleading, but if all four analyses start pointing in the same direction, that's when we should start paying attention. Of course, none of that matters if the data isn't any good. So before we run a single analysis, let's take a look at where the data came from. All right, so for this project, I built the data set from 4 different categories. The first category is historical performance data, and most of that came from Pro Football Reference. It's one of the most widely used statistical databases in football. Just Google Pro Football Reference. They got a ton of stuff there. They cover other sports as well. But this includes things like sacks, games played, approximate value, and season-by-season production. In other words, the on-field performance that made these players great. The second category is awards and recognition data. Using NFL historical records and award histories, I collected information on Defensive Player of the Year awards, All-Pro selection, Pro Bowl appearances, and other major accomplishments. Football isn't just about production, but it's also about legacy too, right? The third category is historical duo data. For that, I researched some of the most accomplished defensive pairings in NFL history. Players like Reggie White, Jerome Brown. I'm going to list all the legends in the next image. So the goal is to establish a benchmark for what a truly legendary defensive duo looks like. And finally, I created a set of engineered metrics specifically for this project, okay? So using the historical performance data, awards data, and duo data, I built measurements such as dominance scores, peak production scores. You could say in that data science, the feature engineering side, right? Historical rankings and outlier indicators. These aren't statistics that came from a website. They are measurements designed to help compare players and duos across different eras of football. You have to normalize everything, right? The game was different 30 years ago than it is today, so you got to normalize that. So now collecting the data is only half the battle, right? Because before Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett can be compared to NFL history, we first need to define NFL history. Who are the players? Who are the duos? Who are the legends that set the standard? Let's meet the field. This is the field. The names that define defensive greatness in NFL history. Hall of Famers, champions, defensive players of the year, players who spent entire careers becoming the standard everyone else would be measured against. Every era had its legends. The 1970s gave us names like Mean Joe Green and the Steel Curtain. The 1980s brought Lawrence Taylor, LT, and Leonard Marshall. The 1990s featured dominant pairings like Reggie White and Jerome Brown. The 2000s gave us players like Michael Strahan, Julius Peppers, and Warren Sapp. The 2010s introduced stars like J.J. Watt, Von Miller, and of course Aaron Donald. And today, players like Myles Garrett, T.J. Watt, Micah Parsons, and Nick Bosa are carrying that tradition forward. And that's the challenge facing Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett, because if we're going to call something historic, these are the names we have to compare it against. This is the benchmark, the competition, right? The legends that have already secured their place in NFL history. And each one of these legends and duos is a data point that has been collected for the analysis going forward, right? Okay, but before we can ask where Donald and Garrett rank as a duo, we need to first answer a simple question. Where do they rank individually? Because every legendary duo starts with legendary players. And to answer this question, I built a greatness model. Instead of relying on a single statistic, the model evaluates players across 5 different dimensions: peak dominance, career value, longevity, efficiency, and awards and recognition. Think of it like building a scouting report for NFL history. Each player receives a score in each category, and then I compare how they stack up against one another. And to make the comparison fair, each category is converted into a percentile ranking. So, a player with a score of 90, for example, performed better than roughly 90% of the players in the dataset for that category. The overall greatness score is then created by combining those 5 dimensions into a single profile. So instead of asking who has the most sacks or who has the most awards, the model asks a broader question. How complete is a player's resume when you look at every aspect of greatness together or their game together? What the model immediately found was that greatness isn't one thing. There are actual multiple paths to becoming an all-time great. Reggie White emerged as the complete package, elite across every category, no major weakness. The model essentially views him as the gold standard. LT Lawrence Taylor took a different path. His peak dominance score was nearly unmatched. The model sees him as one of the most disruptive defensive players the game has ever seen. Bruce Smith represents another archetype entirely, longevity. His career value and durability separated him from almost everyone else in the data set. But the result I was most interested in was Aaron Donald. Donald finished fifth overall in the entire data set. More importantly, he finished as the highest rated interior defensive player, and it wasn't particularly close. The gap between Donald and the next interior defense was enormous. Aaron Donald scored 0.755. Warren Sapp scored 0.597. Dan Hampton scored 0.432. So the model isn't just saying Donald was the best interior defender. It's saying he belongs in a completely different tier. Then there's Myles Garrett. At first glance, his ranking surprised me. He finished 8th overall, but then I started digging deeper. The reason became obvious. Garrett actually led the entire data set in sacks per game at 0.937. Not among active players, not among edge rushers, the entire data set. What holds his ranking back isn't performance, it's time. Players like Reggie White, Bruce Smith, and Aaron Donald have decades of production, awards, and accomplishments built into their profiles. Garrett is still accumulating those pieces, which means the model isn't criticizing what he's done. It's showing just how impressive his trajectory has been. So after looking at individual greatness, the conclusion is pretty straightforward. Aaron Donald has already secured his place among the legends, and Myles Garrett is building a resume that looks remarkably similar to many of the all-time greats. But being individually great is only part of the story, because the real question isn't whether Donald is legendary or whether Garrett is legendary. The real question is what happens when you put both of them on the same defensive line. Okay, so before we combine Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett into a single defensive duo, we need to understand something important. These two players don't play the same position, and that matters more than most people realize, and I'll explain why. So edge defenders and interior defenders aren't playing the same game. When we look across NFL history, elite edge defenders average 113 career sacks. Elite interior defenders average just 62. Peak sack seasons tell a similar story. Elite edge defenders average 17 sacks at their peak. Interior defenders average fewer than 12. Across virtually every traditional pass rushing statistic, edge defenders hold a significant advantage. And honestly, that's exactly what we expect. They're lined up on the outside. They're attacking the quarterback directly. The position is designed to generate pressure. Interior defenders have a much harder job. They are fighting through guards, centers, traps, all different kinds of blocking schemes. They're dealing with double teams. They're getting chipped. And in many cases, their impact never shows up in the box score, which makes the next result incredibly interesting. Aaron Donald isn't supposed to be competing with elite edge rushers, yet somehow he is. Donald's peak sack season was 20 and a half sacks. That's not just elite for an interior defender. That actually exceeds the average peak season of the elite edge defenders in this data set. Think about that for a second. The position that historically produces fewer sacks, fewer pass rush opportunities, and lower career production produced a player whose peak performance rivals some of the greatest edge rushers the sport has ever seen. And that's why this analysis changes how we should view Aaron Donald's greatness. It's not just about what he accomplished, it's about where he accomplished it. The model isn't simply saying Aaron Donald was great, it's saying Aaron Donald was doing edge rusher things from a position that historically doesn't produce edge rusher numbers. And that's a very different conversation, right? Which creates an interesting problem for the rest of the league. Because if Myles Garrett already represents one of the most productive edge rushers in football, what happens when you pair him with the most dominant interior defender in this data set? And that's what we'll explore next. All right, so to explore this and answer that question, I had to build two new measurements specifically for this analysis. The first is called Career Power Score. The idea is simple. Take the greatness profiles I built in Analysis 1 and combine them into a single score. Instead of evaluating one player's resume, we're evaluating the combined resume of an entire duo. Think of it as a total defensive firepower. The second metric is same season greatness. This one works a little different. Instead of looking at everything a player accomplished throughout his career, it only looks at seasons where both players were active together. The goal is to measure how dominant a duo actually was when offenses had to deal with both players at the same time. Because those are two very different questions. Career power tells us how strong a pairing looks on paper. Same season greatness tells us what happened when the pairing actually took the field. And when I ran the numbers, the first result came back stronger than I expected. Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett finished fifth all time in career power score, fifth, and they've never played a snap together. The only pairing ahead of them were Bruce Smith and Cornelius Bennett. Aaron Donald and Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware and Von Miller, and Reggie White and Jerome Brown, that's elite company. In fact, most defensive duos spend years building the type of resume that Donald and Garrett already bring into the conversation on day one. But the same season great rankings tell a very different story. Because this is where reputation ends and production begins. The greatness same season duos weren't simply great players, they were great players producing elite numbers at the same time. Lawrence Taylor and Leonard Marshall, Reggie White and Jerome Brown, TJ Watt and Cameron Hayward. These pairings weren't dominant because of what they did individually. They were dominant because offenses had to deal with both players simultaneously. Many of these duos produced more than 30 combined sacks and more than 30 combined adjusted value in the same season, and that's the benchmark. That's the standard Donald and Garrett would eventually need to reach. And that's what makes this result so fascinating. Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett already rank among the strongest defensive pairings ever assembled before they've even shared a defensive snap. The data says they belong in the conversation. The only question left is how high they can climb once the game actually begins. But before we answer that, there's one final test. Because being great doesn't necessarily make you unique. The greatest players and duos in NFL history are often outliers, performance so far outside the norm that they almost break the model itself. So let's find out whether Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett belong in that category. Okay, so to figure out if this duo would be an outlier, I needed to build an outlier score, and that's what I did. The goal of this metric isn't to measure greatness. I've already done that. It's designed to measure rarity. In other words, how unusual is a duo when compared to every other pairing in the data set? To calculate the score, I combined the categories that consistently appeared throughout this project: career production, peak production, efficiency, awards, and overall impact. The model then looks for pairings that separate themselves from the rest of the field across multiple dimensions at the same time. Because truly historic outliers don't dominate in just one area, they dominate everywhere. And when I ran the numbers, this is where the project got really interesting. Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett finished with an outlier score of 0.9, the highest score in the entire comparison set. Not second, not fifth, number one. The model classified them as a historical outlier. In fact, they're the only duo in the entire data set to cross the historical outlier threshold. And when you look at what drove that score, the reason became obvious. Together, they bring more than 236 career sacks, more than 275 career adjusted value, a combined peak of 43 and a half sacks in a single season, a combined peak adjusted value of 43, a career average of 1.66 sacks per game, 12 first team All Pro selections, 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards. Those numbers aren't impressive, just impressive. They're absurd. But what really stood out wasn't any single metric, it was the consistency. The model identified Donald and Garrett as the only pairing that finished at or near the top across every premium category. No other duo led more than 2 categories. Donald and Garrett led all 5. That's what separates an elite pairing from a historical outlier. Elite duos have strength. Historical outliers have almost no weakness. And that's ultimately where the model landed. Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett aren't simply another great defensive duo. They are the only pairing in the comparison set classified as a historical outlier. All right, so before I move on to some final thoughts, let's quickly summarize what we've learned so far. Analysis 1 looked at individual greatness. The model showed that Aaron Donald already belongs among the greatest defensive players in NFL history, and that Myles Garrett is building a resume that increasingly places him in that same conversation. Analysis 2 added important context. Elite interior production is significantly rarer than elite edge production, which means Aaron Donald wasn't just dominant, he was dominant from position that historically doesn't produce those kinds of numbers, his sack numbers, right? Analysis 3 shifted from individual players to defensive duos. And when I combine their profiles, Garrett and Donald already ranked among the strongest defensive pairings ever assembled, and that's before they've ever taken a snap together. The fourth analysis asked the final question: are they simply elite or historically unusual? The answer was clear. Garrett and Donald were the only duo in the entire comparison set classified as a historical outlier. 4 different analyses, 4 different perspectives, and yet every path led to the same destination. Aaron Donald and Myles Garrett aren't entering the conversation as another promising defensive pairing. They're entering the conversation as one of the strongest defensive combinations, if ever assembled. The evidence didn't point in 4 different directions. It consistently pointed in the same one. Okay. Final thoughts here. All right. Final thoughts. I have to bring us all back to reality. Okay. This is where we had our fun thought experiment of what these two would be like together and how historic it would be, how much of an outlier in a good way they would be. But the reality is that Aaron Donald is retired, right? It's a moderate percent chance that he would come back, and we don't even know the type of shape he's in or anything like that. We would, we're basically looking at what Aaron Donald did in his NFL days. Would he still be the same? Now, I've seen some of his TikTok videos or other videos of him. He still looks pretty mean. I wouldn't mess with the guy. I don't think he's scared of a weight room by any means. He's still lifting. He's still working out. I think it's just like genetics for that guy, right? Like I have 100% confidence that he could come back and be the same, almost like Brady. I mean, Brady, yeah, that guy doesn't look like he's aged either. So Yeah, I personally think that if he did come back, he'd be in the same shape. And these, like I said, these are my final thoughts, more like editorial. I don't have any data to back that up or say it. This is just kind of my fun personal thoughts. But regardless, Myles Garrett, from the data, what I've seen is he's on this trajectory or curve to be one of the best all time. He already is, right? And what's mind blowing is that Aaron Donald was getting these sack numbers as an interior defenseman, like lining up over nose, other techniques, getting that the same amount of sack productions is just like absurd. And I can't imagine how an offense would scheme to block those two. It boggles my mind. And I know there's plenty. I've seen on social media. I'm sure a lot of teams in the NFL don't want Donald to come back and play with Myles because I think they're aware of how dominant that duo would be. But just from a pure sports fan, like it would be incredibly fun to watch those two play together. I can tell you this: fantasy football, if my team, my starters were playing the Rams, I would fade them all. I would not be starting them. I'll just say that. And with that, I appreciate it. Everybody, stay tuned for the next one. Okay. One more quick thing I need to mention is I'm working on a GitHub kind of repository organizational page where I'm going to have all the data sets and R scripts from my analysis up there. I'll have that link in the description. If you don't see it up there when this video gets posted, just come back to it. It'll be there eventually. All right.